much. I do appreciate it, Jose. I'm either the guy that always gets invited back or the guy you can't get rid of. I don't know, but I like that idea of wine-driven presentation. Sounds like a thing. It's very gratifying to see. I can't see much of you, but I think there are people out there. The lights are bright. I am very gratified that you are here, especially considering there's a freaking car being built in the lobby. That's just mental. Well, okay. I still have to compete with that. So what Jose didn't mention is that I've recently co-authored a book that's just been released. Very proud of that. Has anyone got this book? Yeah, so I've just co-authored this book. I say co-authored. Technically, Lisa and Janet are like the official authors, and they managed to get their names on the cover and that kind of thing. But there are contributions. Yeah, indeed, not just from Goike. I think there are others, aren't there? Yes. Okay. Where are we? Hang on. Stay with me. No, it's alphabetical, isn't it? I'm going to have to go back up. By the way, if you see your name here, or you drink beer with someone whose name you see here, you're allowed to go woohoo when you see it. So, okay, there we are. Okay, where are these? There we are. Hurrah! So, of those who have this book, how many of you have made it to, and be honest now, page 403? No one? Okay. Well, that's good. That means this will all be fresh for you. Yes, I was very honored to be asked to contribute to this excellent book, along with many other great contributors, of course. So the subject of my talk is essentially something that you will find some of the write-up on in the book, but I'm going to sort of give you the live version, if you like. What I did when I was asked if I had something to contribute to the book, I said, well, I've got this thing that, I've been using for a few years now. It is proving to be quite useful to me. I think it's something that people get some value out of if we share. And I sort of said, well, it's this model that I call the pillars of testing. And it's because I sort of, I lazily described it as, well, I represent this model as a temple, and it's got a roof, and it's got some pillars, and it's got some foundations. Now, that was probably a bit remiss of me to just sort of send it off like that when I thought, those probably aren't the right terms for these things. So, well, that unfortunately is already in print, but at least had time in preparing this talk to say, well, I probably ought to do a bit of research. I probably ought to understand what these things are called. And in fact, what I should have said, that this was in the style of a tetrastyle ionic temple with a pediment, columns, not pillars, columns, and crepidoma. Because I reached one of those moments where you sort of had this sharp spike in the number of things you realize you know nothing about, when I started to look into what the Greeks actually called these very bits of their architecture. And I thought, why did I pick the temple as my model? It's tetrastyle because it has exactly 4 columns. If it was a hexastyle, it would have 6, so on. And it's not just a Greek temple, it's an Ionic temple. Does anyone know why? So there are 3 orders of classical architecture. Aha, yes, the frilly things on there. Good man. Yes, there are 3 orders of classical Greek architecture. There is the Doric order, the Ionic order, and the Corinthian order. And the easiest way to tell them apart is by these bits that sit on top of the columns, known as the capitals, of course. So classical Greek capitals each have a very distinct style. So we know that this little diagram was Ionic because those frilly bits that Lars pointed out, which are in fact called volutes. So you're learning stuff already, aren't you? I bet you didn't know this. Those are the characteristics of Ionic. The Corinthian style favors these sort of slightly fluty leaf-like structures on them. So those are classical Greek capitals. As compared with modern Greek capitals, there is only one. Come on, guys, it's a dry subject. I'm trying my hardest here. Yes, Athens is the city with the most Greek people in it. The second largest Greek city is Thessaloniki. I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly. Anyone know the third? The city in the world with the third highest number of Greek people? Melbourne, Australia. Yes. More Greeks in Melbourne than in any city in the world other than Athens and Thessaloniki, including all the other cities in Greece. And then, of course, there's Roman capitals. Oh, give me a break, guys. Come on. Yeah. If I was telling this at a typesetting conference, they're rolling in the floor at that one. Okay, well, I knew it was going to be a tough thing, so I thought, well, maybe I needed to bring some ancient Greek jokes. Unfortunately, there really aren't that many of them. A few have survived. I'll share one with you now. Let's see if I remember it well. They have a tendency like to send up academics and intellectuals. So there's a joke that goes, a professor goes for a swim and nearly drowns. So he swears that he's never going to go into the water again until he has properly learned to swim. Yeah, exactly. That was the best of a bad bunch, There we are. Here's your Venn diagram. We've got to get academic here. I should just get on with the thing I'm supposed to be talking about. As you remember Bob's model. First, I tells them what I'm going to tell them. Then I tells them what I told them. Well, I've told you what I'm going to tell you. Now I'm going to tell you. So this pillars thing, it's a model that works for me. Okay. So whenever I use the word model, I like to put this caveat in place. Okay. It's a nice quote from George Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Okay, so I'm hoping there'll be something you'll find useful in this for you. We can't treat it as gospel. The other phrase I like, we heard it from Joe this morning, your mileage may vary. Okay, I developed this because it was fits the nature of the kind of work I do and the kind of organizations I need to work with. I'm hoping there's enough overlap that you'll get something out of it, but I can't guarantee that. And what is it? The model, well, I would say it's a set, or to be even more caveat-like, it's a subset of things that we would like to create or improve within an overall development or development and test process. And what I particularly focus on here is that it's about examining the implicit relationships that make that create dependencies between these items that we have. So if we're trying to say, I would like to improve X, there is a presumed limit to how much we can improve that if we have problematic dependencies under that. That's kind of the nature of the model that I'm trying to express. What it isn't is a process definition, okay? So it's not trying to tell you how to do testing. So just a bit of history. There's suddenly, oh my God, noisy and busy. The details don't matter here. It's just really try to give you a sense of where this came from. So quite a number of years ago, this is around 2007, I was doing some consulting for a large international car rental firm. And it was a big review where there was quite a lot to consider, but they wanted basically a root and branch assessment and review of their testing process. How do we go agile, all that sort of stuff. And my colleague and I, Mike Scott, were working on this, and we were quite some way into the process. And we just found, well, there's just so much to deal with here. There are problems pretty much everywhere we look. How do we find some tractable path through this in terms of giving this organization recommendations? So we started to brainstorm all the things that we'd identified as being either missing or problematic or in need of improvement or challenged. And we said, all right, let's just get them all out there and just try to find some patterns here. And so what we started to do is end up saying, well, there are high-level concerns and there are some quite low-level concerns, or there are sort of practices at one point and there are principles at other points. And we sort of just started to find some light between the edges here. And I said, well, it would be quite useful to sort of show the connections between these, and that's why we ended up doing this sort of this graph of connectedness. Or we said, well, we think this is important because it helps to unlock this thing above it. Or we can only get so far with this thing if we achieve all the things below it. And it started, we started a riff on that and found that it was getting, it became quite useful. And I was gratified that we presented this at quite a high level. We actually had the European CTO of this company, and we did a sort of big high-level presentation. There was a fair amount of consultancy-ish sales stuff. And I was a bit concerned because we got to this, and the sales guy on this account was very nervous of this particular picture, or it was a variation of it. And he says, I'm not sure that we should show that. This guy's very high level. And of course, we got to it, and suddenly I could see in his body language, he came forward. He was no longer just hearing the same old blah. He could actually see something he could get his teeth into. And I remember distinctly, he was a German guy, intelligent, as most of them are. He said to me, David, this is a very important graph for us. And I was honored, of course, and touched, but got that geeky thrill. He called it a graph. Yes, he knows what he's talking about. But then that convinced me that there was some traction in this, that if he could recognize the kind of problems that he saw at a broad level as the CTO of his organization in this model or in this diagram, then I felt it had some legs. There was something in this. So over the course of the next few years, I was looking for ways to refine this and generalize it and take out some of the things that were specific to that organization and to that situation. And encouraged by salespeople who wanted to sort of be able to stick it into PowerPoints and things like that, they said, well, simplify, make it a picture. So I said, all right, well, okay, I'll try this. Tried this idea of, there were three important things as far as I was concerned, and I liked the idea, or liked the image, that they're all things that we have that we want to make better. So in this, at the time, that was about rapid feedback, good test cases, and high test coverage. I thought, that you could pretty much see those as laudable goals for any organization, and whatever your context, those are things you probably ought to improve. So I like the idea that confidence is the thing that sits on the top, and these pillars are things we try to build higher to push up confidence. But the limitation of how high you can build those pillars depends on how strong are the things underneath. So unfortunately, what was lost is that a lot of the detail of those dependencies really, got oversimplified in this particular version. So I iterated on that a couple of times and ended up sort of wanting to focus more on, what those dependencies were. We also gained a pillar over time, so we're one louder there. That's pretty cool. And I started to look for patterns and relationships in these things at the bottom. Now, again, I had to make some trade-offs. So in some cases, some of the things that we use in here are pretty broad categories. And so they hide a lot of detail that I might otherwise like to put in. But I wanted to preserve that idea that I could still show this as a picture that made sense to people. They could get this idea of foundations and pillars and an overall goal. Now, of course, I'm not going to win any prizes for artistic style, and when this was sort of the version that I sent off to Lisa and Janet, and I did say, and all the explanatory text that went with it, and I said, since it's a published book, you've probably got people in the publishing place whose job it is to make ugly things like this look good, so can you find one of those people and make it look good? So this was the version that got published. So, admittedly, that color scheme was left a lot to be desired. So, but as I say, I've had time to think about this since. So the version that we're gonna gradually build in competition with the much more sexy car being built outside, will look something like this. Now, if I see a few people trying to photograph things and so forth, I will be going through each of the bits in turn, so don't try to scribble things down at the moment. We'll literally go through a build of the temple. So your first, or your next lesson, and not your first, but your next lesson in classical Greek architecture is that the pediment, which is that triangular bit that sits above the columns, rests not directly on the columns, but it rests on what's known as the entablature. And the entablature consists of several things. It consists of an architrave, a frieze, and a cornice, typically. There are some other things that sometimes go in, but collectively that's known as the entablature. Because this little image I found had these things on here, these little carved details that are usually in the frieze, those are technically known as triglyphs. They don't actually matter to the model, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. So if we were drawing this out, if you had your sheet of A4 clean paper, what would you do? Well, draw your triangle and stick confidence in the middle of it, because that's the thing that, as far as my model is concerned, that's the top of the tree. This was how I opened my keynote last year. The product of testing is confidence. So I won't go into the details of that. You can perhaps look up the video of that if you disagree with that assertion. But importantly, sitting there in the entablature are two new things of safety and courage, because I like to think of confidence logically as a balance of those two things. Imagine if we had a load of courage, but we had no safety, then that's probably just foolhardiness. If we have safety without courage, then really all we've got is stasis and inaction. So I think confidence is the appropriate balance of both those things. Hence, we draw confidence resting on those things. So, moving to the ill-named pillars, they are actually columns. These are easy enough to draw. There's 4 of them, but if you wanted to draw them accurately, you would include an amount of entasis. And that's that sort of slight narrowing of Greek columns that occurs at the top. There's some debate as to exactly why Greek columns do have this entasis, this narrowing. Most people say it's to do with correcting of an optical illusion. If you're actually a normal-sized person walking up the steps of one of these temples and you look up at these mighty pillars, apparently they would look concave if it weren't for this entasis correction. So it's supposed to make them look straight when viewed from human height. Some scholars debate whether that's actually the reason at all. Anyway, you don't need to actually draw the entasis, but we just want 4 columns. So I need to turn you sideways to do this. So our 4 columns are stronger evidence, better test design, greater coverage, and faster feedback. Let's just quickly talk about why these are represented as columns. So, well, each one, pillar/column, is arguably a measurable thing. And I would say it's a valuable quality of testing. So not so much software quality, but a quality that's measurable in our process. We can, as I said earlier, we always know that none of these things are zero value. There's always some extent that you have each of these things, whatever your organization, whatever your context. But however good you think you are, it could be argued you could always improve these things. And the idea is that we want to get a sense of what they mean in our context and help us to understand, are we optimizing one thing to the detriment of another, or are we ignoring one of these columns and attempting to overbuild another, and leading to a sort of imbalance in our model? Let's take a look at what we mean by each of these things. So, stronger evidence. Well, it's around, how convinced or how satisfied are our stakeholders that they really have a good understanding of the information that's provided by our testing process. What is the mechanism by which people get that, and therefore, how reliable is that information? Are they relying on word of mouth? Are they relying on reports being given, or can they go see and actually see evidence of quality being assured? Next one, test design, and I'm hastening to add that we're not talking about necessarily big upfront test design. This obviously applies to exploratory test design as well as automated test design. But it's essentially asking the question, well, how appropriate are our tests? How good are they generally? Are they meaningful? How effective are they at finding the kind of bugs that represent the most risk to our system? That's, it's arguably the more difficult one to put a measure on, but logically it's something you should be able to say, however good it is, we know whether we're getting better or worse. Next point is coverage. Well, again, this is a meme that I use a lot. Coverage is always expressed in relation to models. So we can have a complete model, but we can never have complete coverage of it. We can have complete coverage of a model, but we never have a complete model. So we are modeling risk in our system, and we can therefore measure how much we are covering what that model expresses in terms of the actual risk in our system. And finally, fast feedback. Well, obviously, this is a key element of Agile testing generally. We want to get the good work that we're doing in terms of the questions we're answering. We want to get those answers back as quickly as possible. So, but I include in this not just how fast are we executing tests and getting test results, it's really how quickly do we know what we need to do about it when we do find problems? So it's like, how fast are we finding or how fast are we determining what are the remedial actions we need to take? Okay, so that's the columns. The lower part of our model, these steps down below, as I mentioned, are known collectively as the crepidoma, but interestingly, they even have individual names. So the top step of the crepidoma is known as the stylobate, and the remaining steps are known as the stereobate. We don't need to write those on, and in fact, it's a little inconvenient for my model because I tend to sort of treat these as a pair and I treat this as something a little bit different, as we shall see. Let's try to fill in those parts of the gap. So we're now, again, if you're drawing this, we now have to sort of start putting our start with the 2 layers below these columns. And I divide these sections into 3. So I still call them foundations. We know, as far as the architecture analogy goes, that's a bad name. But logically, I think of them as foundations. They're the things we need to sort of have under control in our process, and they're sort of like foundational elements. So there's the 3 things that I would call the team foundations. So key here is collaboration and communication. It's almost a bit of a given these days to say, well, this is necessary for any successful agile process, but I don't think we spend enough time working out why we don't succeed as much as we'd like in terms of gaining collaboration and communication. So that's why I sort of put these other sort of stones underneath. To what extent do we have the appropriate team structures that encourage the right amount of collaboration and communication? When we need to reach people that might be outside the team, other people in the business, other subject matter experts, do we actually have the appropriate level of engagement from those people? How easy it is for us to get the information direct from the experts, direct from the horse's mouth. Those will be the prerequisites, if you like, or the dependencies for successful collaboration and communication. Okay, so now when we move across, and sorry, I should back up a little bit. You can see where the pillars are resting here. So the evidence or the strength of the evidence that we have in relation to testing is clearly a function of how well we're communicating information. So that sort of sits firmly on that stone. But the extent of how successfully we collaborate is also going to have an influence on how good our test design is, because that's where we are gaining our domain knowledge. That's where we're getting insights from business experts who might not be testing experts to help us create and understand what it is we need to be testing better. So sharing the load of the better test case design pillar and the greater coverage pillar are these capability foundations in the center. So mostly this is about test techniques. It's just good old-fashioned, what are the things that we do in testing and how well are we doing them? How well are we applying those to make sure that we're getting the best possible test cases and the greatest coverage that we need from them? But perhaps somewhat obviously, just knowing or just being able to identify or even document those test techniques is not enough. All of that, the successful application of those things is heavily dependent on the skills and experience of the people we have. And if I was drawing these to scale, then arguably skills and experience would be a much wider, much broader stone. I intentionally, put it holding up all of the things on the stylobate on the top floor there. But clearly that's fundamental to the success of this process. Moving across, our right-hand group are the technical foundations. And this is where we have our greatest impact upon how fast is our test feedback. Well, that's really almost a direct function of how good is our automated testing. So effective automation, as I'd say, this is almost where the sort of a lot of the detail that we would like to have is buried. There are so many factors affecting effective automation, and I sort of had to summarize it down to just 2 areas that I felt were the underpinning stones below that. So on the right-hand side, yes, on your right, we've got configuration management. So I used to have things like, environment management, data management, version control, all that sort of thing. But really, collectively, it's all the same thing. It's all about how much of a handle do I have on the assets that I need to use in my process, such that I can have things repeatable, such that I can tear down environments quickly and set them up quickly, that I can restore data that's been affected by side effects of tests and so forth. All of that should become second nature if you've got a good configuration management process. So that's the side of things we can do to make sure we're doing automation better. But then the other side is application testability. So this is where, have we even started with an appropriate architecture that encourages good test-driven development? Have we got an architecture that supports testability? Are we making life easier to be able to ask the questions of our systems and not making it harder? So I've banged on about this for many years, that a testable architecture is a good architecture. The same qualities that make something testable are the things that make it considered architecturally sound, loosely coupled, well layered, cohesive classes, and so forth. So it's really those two things. Things how we sort of manage our environment, and how we design and architect our systems. Both of those sort of underpin effective automation. Now, on our third row, sitting below that, there's these two extra items. So this is just our general case. Well, we know we're trying to represent those dependencies by where these sort of things interlock. My two extra statements here are management and leadership are arguably the things that have a direct influence on the things towards the left, and strong engineering discipline is what influences the things on the right. So management and leadership is really about, are we hiring the right people in the first place? Are we putting appropriate structures in place to allow them to grow and to get the most out of them? Are we removing impediments that's preventing people from communicating with each other when they need to? Those are all sort of in the realm of good agile management and strong leadership. And engineering discipline, you could say, well, isn't that the same as the things we talked about? Well, when I sort of chatted about this with various people during sort of the review of this model, we came to the conclusion that engineering discipline is something else. It is something that says you either know that this is the right thing to do or you don't. And we are therefore seeing organizations that are falling down. They might have aspirations to have good testable architectures. They might have aspirations for getting configuration management under control, but they just haven't formed those habits. The engineering discipline wasn't a part of their company culture or mindset. Now, there is, of course, another layer sort of below the ground. There's the actual foundations upon which we've built all of this. And much to my surprise, the Greeks even had a special name for that as well. So the actual foundations, or at least specifically the top layer of the foundations, is known as the youth interior. You do need to spell that correctly, because otherwise you might think you're talking about a teenager's bedroom. Come on, I've got to get something in here, guys. So the youth interior, the foundations, this is really, if you think about it, this is the most important thing. This is, well, where have we even chosen to build our temple in the first place? How safe are all the sort of grand designs we might have in building these things higher and more elaborately, when we perhaps can't rely on the strength of our foundations? So the element that I reserve for sort of putting into that spot, into the youth interior of our model, is what I would argue is the most important thing, but also perhaps the most difficult thing to change. And that's why I say it's kind of where you build your temple, because once built, this is probably going to be the most difficult thing to correct. You can't really refactor a foundation terribly easily. So yeah, your organizational culture, your company values, these will limit everything else above it. So if we talk about, the importance of having good engineering discipline, if there just isn't a culture that encourages people to grow and learn and to support each other in terms of skill sharing and so forth, if we don't have a culture of supportive management, if we've falling into old style habits of performance measurement and so forth rather than self-organization, all that probably stems from an underlying cultural value that's at odds with, the aspirations of succeeding with Agile. That really, gosh, I was quicker than I thought. You can tell it's not a rehearsed slide. That is the model, but you might be asking the question, okay, well, fine, I've taken my pictures, or I've written that down, or I've got that in the book, but what next? What do I do with this? Well, I've got 3 possible bits of advice. You can use it as a discovery tool. So, as I said, a model is a model, but it's just something that might hopefully encourage some discussion. So, use this as a way of saying, well, what do we think of this? Can we see ourselves on this this map? Do we recognize the elements in here? Do we agree with it or not? You might want to say, well, if we're discussing problems in retrospectives and we keep seeing the same things coming up, we say, well, perhaps want to get to the root cause of this. Maybe this model is a helpful way to sort of find your way through that and say, well, really, we kind of thought the problem was here. Maybe this is something more fundamental. Maybe there's something else outside of the team's control that perhaps we need to sort of address. The context in which I tend to use it the most is assessment, but obviously that's, I tend to get paid to do that for organizations. You can use it as a self-assessment tool. And the way that I encourage, or the way I like to do this, if it is a self-assessment, is just survey people where you're asking pertinent questions that are designed to tease out information about each of these items on this model. And if you do that, there's always 2 things I like to include from the survey. I like to say to people, on a simple scale, how well do we think we do this, or how successful is this particular aspect in our organization? And then separately from that, I ask, and how important is that to our success? How important is that particular topic in terms of things we need to pay attention to? The reason I like to sample those things separately is that they give very, very revealing information when you compare the answers of a bunch of people who might be working in the same context, and you discover that people have quite different views on what they think are important or what is successful. So, it will reveal a couple of things. It will reveal your obvious hotspots. We all agree this is crap, and we all agree this is important enough to fix it. Let's do something about it. But when you see some people say, we're bad at this and it's really important, or other people say, well, okay, we might be bad at automation, but how important is that to us? That discrepancy between perceived importance is a real danger sign as well. And that's the thing that often leads to problems not being solved, because we don't have a collective agreement on what we think is important to fix. And here's your 3rd option. Maybe you say, this is bollocks. That's fine, but I want you to think about why it's bollocks. Okay? Put up a counter argument. It's much easier to challenge and critique something that's in front of you than it is to sort of start from a blank page and say, well, we're going to create the model that's right for us. So if you think it's not right, that's fine. Let that be the starting point for you discussing with other people who are going to have an input and an opinion on that, to say, all right, so if it's not right, in what way is it not right? What's different? What are the things that we need to add? Or what's wrong? Which things are in the wrong place? I guarantee you'll actually have a useful process when you go through that, whereby you've said, okay, yeah, now we've created something that is useful to us. So that was my model. I'm leaving that with you as my gift to you. I have another gift to you, which is that I have actually released a book which actually does have my name on the cover, and I have properly co-authored it. I don't know if it's as good as the other book we mentioned, but we quite like it. As a free gift to everyone in the conference here today, if you follow that URL, that will take you to LeanPub. You get the electronic version of this book for free. It's got a couple of 5-star ratings on Amazon. I also need to remind you that you need to rate my session. So yes, after you've downloaded your 5-star free book that I've given to you, please rate my session. Thank you very much.
Any questions? So.
One.
It's a very good book. The 50.
Just in case anyone had any doubts.
It's very good.
The
No,
book is good.
not mine. Yours.
Oh, I thought
the
you meant the
50
other
ideas.
one. No, all right.
The 50 ideas. Excellent book.
Okay. More questions or comments? So, on the back. Okay. Wait.
Yes, thank you. Do you consider this model some kind of maturity thing? So when you would change, like, say, better test design, then you should be aware that the stones under there must be solid enough.
Yeah, I mean, it was never intended to be a maturity model in the sense of being able to score somebody at a particular level on it. It was intended to be a potential process improvement type model. That is, we should be able to say, well, we will color code the bits on this model at a point in time, and we will review that at another point in time to determine if we've got better or worse, or if we've now sort of filled in some of the bricks that are allowing us to sort of safely improve this case. But it's never I dislike any sort of color by numbers type of thing, to be honest. It was meant to be essentially a discussion tool or a basis for being able to say, this is what we mean when we think we've got problems in this or that area.
Thank you. More questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, one more.
Bob.
Okay.
We have the time. So.
Okay. Okay.
You were talking about the youth interior.
Yes.
I'm just wondering what kind of optimal organization culture and values would suit this model. Where would you build a temple? Would you build it on a solid rock or a swamp? What would be the characteristics of a solid rock foundation?
Well, I've never been in a situation where I've had that choice, and that's why I sort of, from my use of the model, it's always been a case of, well, what can we examine about our culture in our organization that might be sort of leading to dysfunctions that may be limiting other things. Where I've seen great confidence in agile testing occur tend to be smaller organizations where that's sort of been part of the philosophy of the way the organization is built. That is, we build a test-driven organization. It's always been more challenged in larger organizations that have perhaps been built without any particular assumption about being test-driven, and hence things that are perceived to be something specific to a development process or something specific to a test process surely can't be influenced by our organizational culture. I find in reality that is where the problems lie. So my personal preference is small and lean is the right sort of organizational culture that's going to give you the most likelihood of success here. But that's kind of a truism for a group like this, I think.
More questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
All right.
Was
Thank
great.
you. Thank you, and enjoy the car.